Hello, classes. It's Mr. Burnett again, possibly for the last time this year. We're going to talk about the legacy of Reconstruction on today's lecture, or this particular lecture. I'm also going to try to talk about what we call the Compromise of 1877, which put an end to Reconstruction. If this lecture gets too long, I may break these up into two lectures, but I'm going to try to get it all done in one lecture. All right, so we've talked several lectures now about Reconstruction, so we're at the point where we need to ask, what is its legacy? What did Reconstruction accomplish? And remember, I've described a lot of the actions in Reconstruction like a ping pong match, the radical Republicans and the federal government trying to extend rights to the former slaves, Southern states, the former members of the Confederacy, trying to take those rights away. And so we're going to talk about the effects of both of those. In terms of helping out the former slaves and trying to come up with a more equal and just country, there were some successes during Reconstruction. First, large numbers of African Americans voted for the first time. And as we've seen, the southern states in particular really, people, at least certain people in those southern states, really did their best to try to prevent this from happening. But it did happen for the first time during Reconstruction. Next, African Americans start getting elected to political office for the first time. But as I put on the slide there, unfortunately, it's also going to generally be for the last time for another 100 years. And I'll go ahead and give you a spoiler. How this ends is African Americans did receive, rights that had been denied them for so long during Reconstruction. They started voting. They started getting elected to political office. But ultimately, the black codes, the Jim Crow laws, are going to take those rights away from them. And it's not going to be until the Civil Rights Movement, in the 1960s, and Martin Luther King and his coalition are going to help start restoring those rights again. So there's going to be some gains in political and civil rights for African Americans during Reconstruction, but they're mostly going to be taken away in the 100 years after Reconstruction. But let's talk about those gains. In 1870, this man I have pictured here, Hiram Rhodes Revels, he becomes the first African American to serve in the U.S. Senate. And one of the great ironies here is he takes over Jefferson Davis's seat. All right, now we remember Jefferson Davis. He was the president of the Confederate States of America. But before the Civil War, before secession, he had been a senator. All right, he had been a senator from Mississippi. And when Mississippi secedes, he quits the Senate and becomes the president of the Confederacy. But after the Civil War, when Mississippi rejoins the Union, his seat is still vacant. All right, no one from Mississippi has taken over his seat in the Senate, and Hiram Rhodes Revels is appointed to be the senator for his seat. So Jefferson Davis, he quits the Senate, tries to form a new country that's going to preserve slavery. His efforts in that respect fail. Not only does he not preserve slavery, but his Senate seat is essentially taken away from him and given to an African American. So Hiram Rhodes Revels has his place in U.S. history as the first African American senator. He serves out the end of Jefferson Davis's term. There's only about a year or two left on it, but Revels does serve out the term, becoming the first African American senator. The first African American to serve a full Senate term is this man named Blanche Bruce. He's appointed to the U.S. Senate in 1875. And as I put there, he will be the last African American senator for 85 years. And he does serve the full 6 years of his term, so he's the first African American to serve a full 6 years. Just as an aside, on these slides, I keep saying they were appointed senator. That may sound odd to your ears, but throughout the 17 and 1800s, we did not elect senators directly. They were appointed by the state legislature. All right, so now every couple of years we have elections, and people vote on the senators for their states. But that wasn't the case for most of our country's history. They had to amend the Constitution in the early 1900s to make that the case. Before then, each state, their legislature appointed senators. And so the Mississippi legislature appointed Blanche Bruce to be its senator in 1875. He served 6 years. By the time his term was over, Reconstruction would also be over. And those gains that I talked about for African Americans would be taken away. But in addition to Revels and Bruce, there were 16 African Americans elected to the House of Representatives. And in all, there were about 2,000 African Americans that were either elected or appointed to either local, state, or national office in the years after the Civil War. And so to put this in perspective, we talk about Revels being a senator in 1870, Blanche Bruce in 1875. Today, I believe there are only 3 African Americans in the Senate. So, you had 2 in the Senate, albeit not at the exact same time, back during Reconstruction. So, you see, this was a monumental change for, even going back to Jamestown, and when America was an English colony, African Americans had been denied any part of the political process. But then in the very late 1860s and early to mid 1870s, not only are they given a part, but they play a big role. Say a couple thousand African Americans end up holding office during this time period. However, again, the ping pong match. For every good thing happening on one side of the net, something bad happens on the other side of the net. And Reconstruction is also the time where the Ku Klux Klan was created. And pretty much as soon as the Civil War ended, as you know by now, Southerners opposed their former slaves attaining political rights, and many Southerners formed what was ultimately called the Ku Klux Klan. And it's believed that one of the Confederate generals, a man named Nathan Bedford Forrest, became the first Grand Wizard in 1867, so sort of the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, he did deny this accusation. He was called to Congress and asked if he hadn't been named the Grand Wizard, and he denied it. But it does seem like at least many, if not most, historians believe he, in fact, was very heavily involved in the Ku Klux Klan. Now, understand about the Ku Klux Klan. There was a Grand Wizard, like I say, but it wasn't a 100% formal, organized group where one person in a central location was making decisions for all the other locations. They were really more of a lot of different groups in different states and cities that were basically loosely affiliated. They used the same name, adopted the same tactics, certainly, but there wasn't necessarily a very formal hierarchy among them all. It was more different Klan groups or chapters, you might call them, in different cities sprang up. But they did use a lot of the same tactics, and they were pretty prevalent during this time period. All right, so what they do? One, they used intimidation. We've all seen images of them burning crosses. But more than intimidation, they used outright violence. They would beat people, they would kill some people in order to stop Reconstruction policies and preventing African Americans from exercising their rights. In our last lecture, we talked about one of U.S. Grant's legislative accomplishments during his presidency was the Enforcement Acts, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts. And these were important to Grant because he was hearing stories about these problems throughout the South when African Americans would try to vote. They'd be intimidated or beaten so that they weren't allowed to vote. And so he felt it was important to pass these acts in order to try to stop what was happening through the South. This also gave a rise, this time period gave rise to what we call lynching. When someone is lynched, it basically means hanging someone illegally. There's no judge, no jury, no trial, oftentimes for very flimsy, if any, reasons at all. But this was one of the tactics the Klan would use against people. They'd capture them and just basically hang them from the nearest tree they could find in order to kill them. We know the Klan killed at least is in italics there for a reason, at least 7 African American politicians. All right, so on the last or a few slides ago, I talked about how 2,000 African Americans took office during Reconstruction. We know of at least 7 of them were killed. It could have been more, but we know at least 7. And certainly many other non-politicians were killed during this time period as well. These killings often done with by members of the Klan or people affiliated with them. And the Klan, now most of their violence, for sure, most of their violence and intimidation was directed at the former slaves, the African Americans. But they also even attacked, those group carpetbaggers and scalawags. We talked about them in the previous lecture. So even if someone was just supporting Reconstruction, and trying to help the African Americans, those people could end up being the victims of this Klan terrorist organization. All right, so while most of the violence and intimidation of the Klan was directed towards African Americans, they did attack white people, the carpetbaggers and scalawags as well. All right, so more formally or more legally, the Southern states also adopted black codes to deprive former slaves of their rights. So the Klan was always operating somewhat outside the law, and I say somewhat because a lot of times the sheriff or the police in the local town didn't really care to stop them. So what the Klan was doing wasn't technically legal, but none of the law enforcement officials in that area would do anything to stop them. So it's technically illegal, but there was really no chance of them being punished for what they were doing. However, Southern states also took more, again, somewhat legal. Now you can argue a lot of these things they did violated the Constitution, but they tried to give it the air of legality by passing laws that they call the Black Codes. We've talked about these before, but let's just sum up some of the Black Codes that were passed during Reconstruction. They came up with what was called a poll tax. All right, a poll is another name for a vote or a voting place. And this required people to pay a tax before you could vote. All right, now how was this aimed at keeping former slaves from voting? Well, remember, slaves weren't paid for their work. All right, so these people had lived their entire lives in slavery, and sure, the 13th Amendment frees them, but they don't have any money. And so when the vote rolls around, they go to vote, but the states said, "Oh, I'm sorry, you don't have any money to pay the poll tax, so you can't vote." All right, so this is one of the ways they try to keep African Americans from voting. Next were literacy tests, in which someone would have to prove that they could read before they were allowed to vote. Again, it was illegal in most of these slave states to teach a slave to read and write. So after After the Civil War and after the 13th Amendment was passed, again, the former slaves were freed, but they had never been allowed to go to school. They hadn't been taught to read and write. So this was another way to prevent them. Since they couldn't read or write, they weren't allowed to vote. Of course, now this is a time period before everyone automatically started going to school as soon as they turned 5 years old. So there were plenty of white people who couldn't read. There were plenty of white people who were poor. So in order not to deprive white people the right to vote, these laws had what were called grandfather clauses. And it would basically say something along the lines of, well, if your father or grandfather was eligible to vote, then you don't have to pass these literacy tests. All right, so now obviously none of the slaves had fathers or grandfathers who had been allowed to vote. So, none of the former slaves or African Americans in general could get around these literacy or poll taxes by these grandfather clauses, but allowed white people to get around them. So again, it's easy to see that these laws were directly aimed towards preventing African Americans from voting, even if they didn't specifically say we're not allowing African Americans to vote, because that, of course, would have violated the 15th Amendment. So some of the states couldn't come out and just say, well, we won't allow African Americans to vote. But they would find ways around it through the poll tax, the literacy test, etc., to accomplish the same ends, just through different means. All right, another law passed in a lot of former Confederate states dealt with labor contracts. And they essentially required African Americans to have a contract to work. Remember, lived an entire life in slavery. 1865, the 13th Amendment's passed. They're free. But what do? They don't have a job anymore. Or no, well, they've never had a job. That's poor language. They never had a job because they weren't allowed to. They don't have any money. They no longer have a guaranteed place to live. So what would happen is the southern states passed these laws that said, well, okay, African Americans have to be under contract to work with a white property owner. And if you don't have a contract, you can get thrown in jail. All right, so in other words, it was illegal for an African American essentially to be unemployed. If an African American entered into a contract with a white property owner, and the African American basically didn't want to work there anymore and tried to quit before the contract was over, the African American could again be put in jail. And of course, as we talked about over and over again, these African Americans had never, the vast majority of them had never been taught to read or write. So often they couldn't read the contracts that were being given to them by white property owners. So as you can expect, these contracts weren't exactly fair. But even if they weren't fair, it was illegal for the African American to break the contract because they could be put in jail. So again, you see this system put in place where, I mean, it's not exactly slavery, but it's still getting to the same result where, these African Americans are forced to work for the white plantation owners, whether the African Americans really want to or not. All right, so it's clear that, the 13th, 14th Amendments were passed, but it wasn't like you had automatic equality and fairness. Some of the other restrictions and laws passed during the Black Codes, African Americans were forbidden from owning guns, from serving on juries, from marrying white persons, and those types of things. And, referred to as the Black Codes, during the Reconstruction time period, these types of laws will later be called Jim Crow laws. And a lot of these laws, particularly like the poll tax, literacy test, they would survive. The poll tax survived until the Constitution was amended in the 24th Amendment. That would be more towards the mid 1900s, essentially. And these types of laws that discriminated against African Americans would stay on the books all the way up through the Civil Rights Movement, which was 100 years later. Now, the Southern economy, as we've talked about since probably the second or third week of school, the Southern economy is based on cash crops, and slaves were doing a lot of the labor. But the 13th Amendment says the Southern economy can no longer use slave labor to do the work, so they had to come up with a new system. And the system they came up with was sharecropping. And in sharecropping, the name it somewhat what the name suggests. People are going to share the crops. And basically, the white landowners would provide the seeds and the land. And then a sharecropper, certainly during Reconstruction, these were often former slaves. Eventually, the sharecropping system is going to be around long enough that even white workers would become sharecroppers. But certainly during Reconstruction, it was mostly the former slaves. And these former slaves would agree to take the plantation owners' seed, use part of their land to grow crops. And they were often told to grow cash crops, i.e. cotton would have been the big one. So the idea was the sharecropper, right, the worker, would spend all year growing the crop. Once the crop was ready for harvest, it'd be picked, sold off, and the landowner and the sharecropper would split the money. So for our hypothetical, let's say they're going to split it 50-50. The landowner would get half the money and the sharecropper would get half the money. Now, first of all, one issue is that the sharecroppers would do the work, pick cotton, and then the landowner or one of the landowner's agents would sell the crop. So, this system was absolutely ripe for corruption, and the landowner could take advantage of the sharecropper and not tell them, the true price that was received from selling the crop, or not giving them their fair share. So that was one very big flaw in the system. The other flaw is the very fact that the sharecroppers were being made to grow cash crops and to sell what they were growing, which meant they couldn't really grow their own food. And so throughout the year, they're having to buy food, they're having to buy the clothing. But again, never been paid in cash for all their years of work as a slave. So they don't have money to buy these things. So they have to go into debt. They buy these things usually from the landowner on credit. So now, before the crop even comes in, the sharecropper owes money to the landowner. And the idea would be, once the sharecropper gets paid at the end of the growing season, they would use the money they make to pay off their debts. However, many times, the amount of money that was made by the sharecropper after selling their share of the crop would not be enough to cover their debt. And so at the end of the year, they still don't have any cash money because everything they sold had to go to pay their debt to the landowner, and they would still owe the landowner. So in the first year, the landowner may have agreed to split the crops 50-50. But in the second year, the landowner would say, well, you owe me for that food and those clothing that I sold you on credit last year. So this year, I'm going to take 60% of the crop. All right. And so now the same thing happens. The worker has to work all year. Again, don't have any cash money. So they have to buy their food and clothing and other things like that, other essentials on credit. But this time they're only getting 40% of the crop profit. And if 50% wasn't enough to pay off their debts, well, then 40% is certainly not going to be enough. All right, so they're stuck in this never-ending cycle of debt and poverty. All right, and so that's why I put this moniker, that title for this section was "As Bad as Slavery?" ? Because once again, former slaves were basically being forced to work on someone else's land for someone else's benefit. All right, now, in reality, I would argue it wasn't quite as bad as slavery. All right, a landowner couldn't, say, sell a sharecropper's child like they could a slave. Um, you know, they, at least legally, really weren't allowed to beat their sharecroppers, to inflict the violence that they could get away with as a slave owner. At least not legally, they couldn't do that. So, sharecropping may not have been quite as bad as slavery. They couldn't have families broken up for being sold and that sort of thing. But it certainly wasn't a fair system. It certainly wasn't the type of freedom that I'm sure the former slaves were looking forward to, that I'm sure Lincoln and Grant had envisioned. So you can see, once again, you get this picture of Reconstruction that, yes, there have been gains. Things have gotten better, but they're still pretty bad for the African Americans. The situation's still pretty bleak. All right. So I've just told you that there's still a lot of unfairness. You have the Black Codes, you have the Ku Klux Klan. And yes, even though that U.S. Grant and Congress passed the Enforcement Acts, which helped, it didn't totally eliminate the Klan in the South. It didn't always guarantee fair votes in the South, or the voting rights were respected. So if at the end of Grant's second term, 1876, if there's still so many problems and so many unfinished promises of Reconstruction, why does Reconstruction end? And first, there were a couple of issues that really had nothing to do with Reconstruction. For one, Grant's administration is famous for the corruption, for people breaking the rules, taking bribes. Now, from what I've read and learned about Grant, it doesn't seem that Grant personally was corrupt. He wasn't really taking bribes or things like that. However, many of the people working for him did. And if you want to give some blame to Grant, you can blame him for the way he picked his appointees and advisors. And a lot of times it wasn't based on who was most qualified, but rather who was related to him or who had worked with him in the Army during the Civil War. So he gave a lot of jobs, a lot of important jobs to people based on their personal connection to him rather than their merit. And Grant simply refused to believe that his friends and family were dishonest, but a lot of them were. A lot of them were very corrupt, and Grant just refused to believe it, so he wouldn't do anything to stop the corruption. So although Grant personally may not have been corrupt, he certainly turned a blind eye to the corruption all around him. Also, during his second term, we have another panic. We have another run on banks. The Panic of 1873 causes an economic depression. All right, so if you recall, there was another panic of 1837, that basically takes down Martin Van Buren's presidency because it leads to an economic depression. Something similar happened during Grant's second term. And so, based on these problems, not to mention just the sheer fact that Reconstruction had been going on, and it just didn't seem to have an end in sight. The support for Reconstruction among voters, among your everyday Republicans, really started to go down, started to wane. And so, you always had your radical Republicans pushing Reconstruction, but there's more and more fighting within the Republican Party over the course of Reconstruction. Certainly, Southerners don't like it. Remember, they've been divided into 5 military districts. The Enforcement Act allows the president to send in the army to enforce the law. And so Southerners see it. Here we are sitting in 1876, and the United States Army has been occupying their territory pretty much since the start of the Civil War in 1861. All right, so the Federal Army has been, invading the South, so to speak, for 15 years now. Certainly, Southerners hate it, but some Northerners also get tired of it. All right, because as we've seen, going way back to the French and Indian War, wars and military expenditures lead to debt. And so people in the North start getting tired of this policy, these Reconstruction issues that seem like they're never going to end. All right, and so there's just simply not widespread support for Reconstruction, once we get to 1876. All right, so the 1876 elections rolled around. Grant has served his 2 terms. As you know, ever since Washington, that had basically been the tradition. If you serve 2 terms, you retired. There had been talk about Grant trying to serve a 3rd term, but because of all these issues I just talked about, that really probably wasn't realistic, so he did end up retiring. Republicans nominate a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes. Democrats nominate Samuel Tilden. And the election is very, very, very close. All right, and let's look on this electoral map. The blue states are for the Democrat Tilden. The red states are for the Republican Hayes. And as you might expect, the South is generally supporting the Republican. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The South is generally supporting the Democrat. Again, going back to the 1860 election when Lincoln was running, the South did not vote for Republicans, except look here at these 3 states. Got Louisiana here, South Carolina, and Florida. All right, you have these 3 red states and all surrounded by blue. All right, and the southern states, the South was very skeptical of these election results because those 3 states just happen to be the only 3 states where you still had basically one of these military governors or a governor appointed by the federal government to run things in the Reconstruction era. All right, so those were the 3 states that really hadn't taken back control of their own government after the Civil War. And lo and behold, they just happened to vote Republican. So the South thinks this is suspicious, and they don't really buy the election results. The election results, by the way, Tilden had won the popular vote. More people voted for Tilden overall. But in the Electoral College, if you added South Carolina and Florida and Louisiana, Hayes won the Electoral College election by 1 vote, by a single vote. And the South was thinking, wait a minute, we shouldn't count South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Those states are really on charge of themselves, and without those, Hayes doesn't win. So once again, just like during the Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr fiasco, just like with John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, Congress is basically going to choose the president. So Congress appoints a 15-person committee, 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Now, my guess is, before I put the next bullet point up, you already know who this committee is going to vote for. All right? We had more Republicans and Democrats on the committee, so yes, they voted for the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. However, to get the Democrats to go along with this result, a compromise was struck. So Republicans essentially had to make certain promises to Democrats. And these promises and this whole election bargain was known as the Compromise of 1877. And oh, by the way, all of this that I've been describing, this committee, this Compromise of 1877, they did not reach a final result until, I believe it was like 4 or 5 days before Grant was to leave office. So, basically a week before Grant's supposed to leave office, the country still doesn't know who the next president's going to be. But regardless, but ultimately, at the last minute, the parties came up with this compromise of 1877, where the Republicans promised certain things to the Democrats, and this compromise is also known as the Great Betrayal. And you'll understand why once I tell you about what was promised. One, Hayes would immediately withdraw federal troops from the South. And remember, the troops were there in large part after the Enforcement Acts to make sure that the South was following the 14th and 15th Amendments and that they were protecting the civil and political rights of the African Americans. And that's why the troops were still there largely. And Hayes just said, well, we'll just take out the troops. And as you can expect, that now allowed the states to enforce their black codes without anybody standing in the way. Can get that name Great Betrayal because of that. Second, Hayes would appoint a Democrat to his administration. And then third, the federal government would give southern states money for railroads and other construction projects. So essentially, Reconstruction was over. And at this point, after the Compromise of 1877 takes place, the federal government is no longer going to make efforts to make sure that the former slaves and the African Americans receive equal treatment. They're no longer going to make sure that the 14th and 15th Amendments are being followed throughout the South. And basically, the federal government is going to essentially turn a blind eye to discrimination for the next almost 100 years, until the civil rights, until Rosa Parks, and the bus boycotts and the March on Selma that took place in the 50s, and then the rest of the civil rights movement continues into the 60s. It's going to be almost 100 years after the Civil War that the federal government once again start making an effort to ensure the constitutional rights of all citizens, regardless of race, are being protected. So this will be our last lecture of the year. I'm sorry that it ends on kind of such a depressing note, but unfortunately, that's just the way it was. Reconstruction, it did pass the 14th and 15th Amendments, and ultimately, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, those amendments would be used to start giving or start permitting equal rights to spread throughout the country. But where we leave off the story here back in 1877, those efforts are really going to be put aside for another 100 years. So that's where the course ends. And this is your last lecture, at least in my class, for this school year.